We are in part 3 of our Christian life or series. Again, it will conclude next week, our fourth part of that with Eric Sousa. In our first installment, we saw that the Christian life is not something, it's not like a moral code that you accept, a way of life that you choose to live, but rather a person needs to be converted. A person needs to be born again. And then once a person's born again, that person needs to then make a commitment to following the Lord. A commitment to say, listen, now my life is going to be lived following after Jesus Christ. We also saw that the words of Paul kind of serve as a guideline for us for this study and also for how we should be living out our lives. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, we read this, "Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, not in my presence only, but much more in my absence." Listen, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. The next verse reads, "Because it is God who works in you to will and to do for his good pleasure." And so Paul is speaking of an internal work of God. God works in you. He's also speaking of an external effort that is the responsibility of the believer. Work out your salvation. And so what we're seeing is that this internal work is the byproduct of abiding in Jesus and growing in him. God's doing something inside of us. We have desires for things that we didn't have desires for before. My personal story is I can tell you that for 17 plus years of my life, I never one time thought whether what I was doing was well-pleasing to God or not. Not one time. In every occasion, when I was trying to determine what I was going to do. So I have a time slot, I have some free time, I'm going to do something. And so the equation to determine what to do, there were various things thrown into the equation. What can I afford? Who can I do it with? What can I get away with? All of the different parts of that equation. Never once did X represent, does this make God happy? But when I met Jesus, that changed. In every situation since, X represents, does this make God happy? Now, I'm not in any way suggesting that I always do what makes God happy. But I can tell you that there's a change. God places desires in us that didn't used to be there. But now with those desires there, we recognize that this external work, the effort on our part, is the byproduct of setting a new target in my life. And saying, I want to make sure that the things that the Bible tells me should be part of my life are part of my life. That's what I'm aiming towards. That's what I'm living for. And I want to constantly examine myself in light of the Scripture. So we talked a lot about how the Bible works as a mirror. We talked about what a mirror does. And then the mirror tells you need to make some serious changes. And so as we go through tonight in our third installment, we're going to, again, let the Bible be a mirror. We're going to let the words of Jesus be a mirror. We're going to let Jesus tell us what he expects of us. We're going to let him examine us. And hopefully we're going to walk out the door and saying, okay, Lord, will you bring about these things in my life? This might be missing from my life. Would you bring this in to my life? We're going to talk about 3 things in our time together tonight. Number 1, we're going to talk about how Jesus has an expectation that his followers bear fruit. Okay? An expectation of Jesus that his followers bear fruit, and we'll talk about what that means. Number 2, we're going to talk about the fact that Jesus has an expectation that his followers live by faith. That's an expectation. He wants us to live that way. Number 3, we're going to talk about how Jesus has an expectation that his followers be involved in evangelism or involved in sharing Christ with others. That's an expectation of Jesus. Now, I understand that the subject of the Christian life and the things that Jesus emphasizes is not something that we can cover in only 4 weeks. We allotted 4 weeks to do this. We could take a whole semester, 5 days a week, 3 hours a day class in order to cover everything that's there. So what I'm doing is highlighting the things that I think are most emphasized. We highlighted last week love. That's the chief commandment, and as it's expressed towards one another is the second greatest commandment. And so we emphasize that. These things, as you read through the gospel narratives, if you start in Matthew, you read through John, you are going to find that Jesus talked a whole lot about fruit bearing, a whole lot about faith, and a whole lot about sharing the gospel message with others when he was with his disciples. One of the things as you read the Gospels, you want to note who the audience is. When Jesus is speaking to an audience that is the multitude, the group of those that have not yet responded to him, his subject matter is different than when he's sitting down collectively with his disciples and he's instructing them. This is a time with the disciples. And what are the things that Jesus emphasized? Number one, let's talk about bearing fruit. Jesus spoke often of his expectation that his followers bear fruit in their lives. In John 15, Jesus said this, "By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit." That's how we glorify God. Later in John 15, he said this, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." And he says, "And I appointed you that you should go and bear fruit." Why were you chosen? So that you could bear fruit. You were selected. You were brought to God. He even explained that the real testimony as to whether or not a person was actually a follower of Christ was the fruit that comes out of their life. Listen to what he said in Matthew 7. "Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear good fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit." I flipped that. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Later in Matthew 12, he said it again. "Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad, for a tree is known by its fruit." And so Jesus listen, you glorify God when fruit is born in your life. But that fruit that's born in your life also testifies to you whether or not you truly are a follower of Jesus Christ. It's what's coming out of your life. Jesus said, in fact, in one of those cases in Matthew 12 there, Jesus is saying, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Like we can know what's going on in here because of what's coming out of here. Now, in Matthew 21, verse 18, it's on the screen, Jesus emphasized, or I should say Jesus illustrated the emphasis that he put on fruit bearing this way. It says, "Now in the morning, as he returned to the city, he was hungry." Now, let's pause there for a second. This is Matthew. He's recording these little, what's the word I'm looking for? Little scenes, small little vignettes of the life and ministry of Jesus. There are all these things they could have talked about. Matthew stops to say, "Listen, I want to tell you something Jesus did." He says, in the morning, he was returning to the city and he was hungry. The next verse says this, "And he saw a fig tree by the road, and he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves. And he said to it, 'Let no fruit grow on you ever again.' And immediately the fig tree withered away." It's like, wait, what? I think, if memory serves me, I think there are 34 individual miracles that Jesus accomplished that are recorded in the New Testament. Okay, there are some of those are references to him healing a vast group of people, but 34 individual miraculous things where Jesus took something broken and made it better. Got a blind guy, got a lame guy, got a deaf guy, got a demoniac, and Jesus, they're broken, and Jesus makes them better. And then Matthew records this incident. He said, "We were just walking this morning, and man, I'm hungry." And he walked up towards this fig tree. He went to grab figs from the tree, and there were no figs on the tree, and he cursed it and went, it just withers, like done. And I think that would stick with you, wouldn't it? I mean, here Matthew's writing later. It stuck with him. Jesus expected a fruit-bearing tree to birth fruit. And it's illustrating that Jesus has an expectation that you and I, as his followers, bear fruit. Now, that being said, what is fruit? Like when the Bible uses the term, we know the Bible does, right? The fruit of the Spirit is, right? We know that term. We saw Jesus said, if you bear fruit, my Father is glorified. And so what is this fruit? Now, biologically speaking, fruit is the reproductive element of a healthy tree. So if you've got a citrus tree, it's going to bear oranges or lemons or grapefruit or whatever. If you got an almond tree, it's going to bear, right? Okay, so we can go down we could spend the rest of the time. I could throw something out, you could answer, but we'll move on. I think you got it. Okay, so biologically speaking, fruit is the reproductive part of a healthy tree. We might say this too about it. Fruit is also the good part, right? From our perspective, fruit, it's the reproduction. So you have an avocado tree, and it bears avocado. That's the fruit. That's the way that the tree reproduces itself. So the seed is in what we call the fruit, and it falls down to the ground, and that part that we call the fruit actually produces nutrients into the soil immediately, and then that soil is now healthy and able to provide so that seed can produce and another tree be birthed. But it's also the good part, right? Like, you don't chew on avocado bark. You don't eat avocado leaves. Okay, if you do, you're a weird hippie, and we'll talk about that later. But the fruit of that's the good part. It's the part that we enjoy. And so listen, fruit is the reproductive part. It's also the enjoyable part. It's the good part. It's the blessed part. And so biblically speaking, we might look at fruit in two ways. Number one, fruit refers to the characteristics of Christ being developed in the follower of Christ. The goal of Jesus was that his followers become like him. So we're born again. We're born of the Spirit. Now it's possible. And then God starts doing an internal work in us. Philippians 2, God works in us to will and to do. And that internal work is happening. Then he gives us a target of what to go at. We make that effort towards, and the characteristics of Christ are developed in our life. That's what Paul was referring to in that famous passage in Galatians 5 where he says, the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and goodness and faithfulness and meekness and self-control. He's saying those characteristics, those are things that are exemplified in the life of Jesus. You get every one of those characteristics, you say, where's that in Jesus' life and where's that in mine? And so we're talking about fruit being developed in us. We're talking about us becoming more like Jesus. The second way that this term fruit is used in the New Testament is to speak of actual reproduction. As a healthy plant reproduces itself, so a healthy Christian will lead others to Christ. There's a reproduction. I think it was that sense that Jesus used the word fruit when he told the parable of the sower and the soils. The guy sows seed on the ground, and the seed lands, and it lands on the good soil, and it produces some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. He's saying that this plant, the seed, a seed produces a plant. A plant grows. If it's healthy, it is going to produce a whole lot more seed. One seed makes a plant that is capable of producing loads of seed. So one plant can reproduce itself over and over and over and over again, is what Jesus is saying. And there's that idea. There's an interesting passage in the book of 1 John where the church, John's writing to a group of believers, and he divides them into three categories. He divides them into little children, new converts, people that are new in their relationship with the Lord. Young men, people that are grown or growing in their relationship with the Lord. And then fathers. The only difference between a young man and a father is reproduction. And so you say, look, the church here is made up of these new believers, growing believers, and reproducing believers. Jesus says that when we bear fruit, that we are going to be glorifying the Father. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize that Jesus addresses those who are not bearing fruit or haven't borne fruit in quite some time. He actually addresses that. In John chapter 15, take a look at the screen. Jesus says this one, by the way, John 15 might be the single most important chapter for you as a follower of Jesus Christ. This John chapter 15, doing John 15, might be the most important chapter as a believer. It talks about your relationship with Jesus Christ. He says, I'm the vine, you're the branches, right? Abide in me. So, I'm the true vine, my Father is the vine dresser. He's setting the scene, he's telling a story. I'm the vine. My Father, he's the one that's the caretaker of the vineyard. Next verse reads this way. Every branch in me that, read this with me, does not bear fruit. Let's do that again. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit. He says, he, that's the vine dresser, what does he do? Takes it away. And then he says, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes that it might bear more fruit. So he's saying in the vineyard, in the church, the vine dresser recognizes two different peoples. He recognizes the branch, the believer who is fruit-bearing, and the believer who is not fruit-bearing. And he says the vine dresser has two different approaches depending upon the individual. The one that is bearing fruit, he prunes. Do you have any people who actually like gardening? Raise your hand if you like gardening, okay? You guys like to have torture plants, okay? You get sharp objects, right? And you trim them, okay? And, so you take that thing, it's like you got this branch sticking out, and you think it doesn't look the way you want it, or it's hanging the way you don't want it, so you, right? Okay? That's got to hurt. Okay? That's what Jesus is saying. Listen, he prunes. So you're going, man, I'm bearing fruit in my life. What's Jesus going to do? Well, he's going to prune you. Because he, the vine dresser, knows that if he shapes the plant just right, it will be most productive. It will bear the characteristics of Christ, and it will reproduce best when I prune it. But then he goes, what about the guy who's not bearing fruit? Or what about the guy who hasn't borne fruit in a while? What does he say he'll do? Take you away. Now that is a very misfortunate translation. Okay? And so if you're sitting here going, okay, like any moment now, doors are going to burst open, even the ones without handles, Grim Reaper's coming in, and you're out of here, okay? This is not a very good translation. The other translations read this way, he lifts them up. Now remember, Jesus is telling a story. And in the story, you have the vine dresser who cares for the productivity of the vineyard. And when the vine dresser looks at a plant that is not bearing fruit, his first thing is not to grab a shovel and rip the plant out. His first thing is to care for the plant so that it might become more fruitful. He lifts it up. In fact, let's go ahead and turn there. You got your Bible in your hand. Luke chapter 13. Let's go there real quick. Luke 13. And Jesus is going to tell a similar story. In this case, he's going to talk not about a vineyard, but about it's a vineyard, but talk about a particular tree within that vineyard. Luke chapter 13, verse 6. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it. And listen, he found none. So he's coming again, same the illustration. We're looking for fruit. There wasn't any fruit. This is a fruitless believer. Then he said to the keeper of the vineyard, look, for 3 years I've come seeking fruit on this fig tree and have found none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? Okay, you're taking up a seat. Somebody else could have that seat. Why don't we just get rid of them, right? Somebody else could have that parking spot. If you didn't take up that parking spot, you fruitless believer. Okay, that's the attitude of this guy. Well, look at what Jesus says. He says, but he answered and said to him, sir, let it alone this year. this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it, and if it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that, you can cut it down. What's the attitude of the caretaker? The attitude of the caretaker is, listen, if it's not bearing fruit, we should give it extra attention. We should lift it up. We should invest in it. So now, here's the time to take out the mirror. You take out the mirror, and you say, is my life bearing the characteristics of Jesus? Is that what's happening? Are the characteristics, when I find myself faced by something that is, difficult or unpleasant, what is coming out of my life? The characteristics of Jesus coming out of my life, or is it the same old stuff that's always come out of my life? And I think, you know what? I'm not really bearing the fruit that I should be bearing. Well, what do you need to do? Well, listen, you need more care. We're not going to send somebody in here to yank you out. What we're going to suggest is you need to take some extra care into your relationship with the Lord. Make some extra investments in your time with the Lord. Take advantage of your morning with Jesus. Take advantage of listening. Honestly, download the app and listen to the Bible teaching on Calvary Radio. Invest in your relationship with the Lord. Put those things in. Let God lift the plant up that you might bear fruit. You go, man, I haven't witnessed to somebody in I don't know how long. Well, listen, you make those investments. Let God lift the plant up that we might be more fruitful. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead a little bit for time's sake, and we're going to talk about our second thing. Second thing we're going to talk about tonight is the fact that Jesus has an expectation that we live by faith. So we should be fruit-bearing. We bear fruit by abiding in Jesus Christ, the fruit that we bear, the characteristics of Christ, and reproduction. But Jesus also expects his followers to walk by faith. Now, we recognize that faith is a necessity. You cannot function in God's kingdom without faith. It's a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I had gone to Germany. I was speaking at a conference in Germany. I arrived there the day before the conference. I got picked up from the airport with a couple other guys. They took us straight to a hotel, and these guys were all exhausted. They'd flown through the night, so they disappeared into hotel rooms. They were gone. And I'm not that guy, so I don't sit well. So I just decided I'd walk around the city. I'm walking around the city and spend an hour or two, and then I thought, I'm kind of hungry. I think I'll get something to eat. So I went back to the hotel room. I'd forgotten to bring any cash with me. But I figured, I don't live in 1968, so I'm fine. I grabbed my credit card, and off I go. And I went into a restaurant right near the airport. I walk in. I said, I'd like to get just one of those kind of takeaway places. And I try to order a sandwich. I take my credit card out. They said, we don't take credit card. I'm in broken German. And actually, they were probably speaking really good German. It just sounded broken to me because I don't speak it. And so I'm like, okay. So I walked farther. I walked like 20 minutes. I came to this outdoor mall area. I go into a place, try to order something to eat. They don't take credit card. I'm walking. I'm in this. I'm thinking. I'm like, this is the 21st century. I think I could not buy food. I'm walking around. This didn't work. And so that night, I didn't eat all day. I got back to the church, and one of the guys I know, I said, man, I forgot to bring any money, cash with me. I tried to use, he goes, yeah, it's weird here. They don't like credit cards. So, sorry. Fortunately, there was food at the conference. But my point in that is not just to tell you how foolish I am when I travel, but to talk about the fact that there's certain currency necessary in order to make exchange in certain kingdoms. And in the kingdom of God, the currency necessary to make exchange is faith. We cannot function without it. Now, first of all, you can't function without it because you can't get into the kingdom without it, right? We're not saved by our works. We're saved by faith. Jesus said this. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. He who doesn't believe is condemned. Like, faith is required. And faith is also necessary for living out our Christian life. Paul put it like this. He said, we walk by faith, not by sight. We have a different way of walking, a different way of functioning within the kingdom. Now, I think it's necessary maybe to talk a little bit. The Bible uses two words, the word faith and the word believe. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about those words. Both words, as we're using them, are verbs. And that is that they denote a required action on our part. Okay? Believe and faith are both verbs that require actions. And both carry the idea of trust. Faith is an active trust in the promises of God in the midst of conflicting circumstances. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Faith is an active trust in the promises of God in the midst of conflicting circumstances. We might add, and conflicting emotions. What happens? Circumstances stir up emotions. And the circumstances and the emotions that are stirred up both speak to us. They're both telling us things. And then we have the promise of God. And the promise of God is usually telling us something very, very different than our circumstances and our emotions are telling us. Faith is when I choose to believe God's promise over my circumstances and over my emotions. Heroic faith is when I continue to believe in the promises of God regardless of my circumstances and the emotions that they've stirred. I just keep holding to it. You know, we have a chapter in the Bible that magnifies that heroic faith of these characters in the Old Testament. And every one of them, they're facing circumstances bigger than themselves. They seem absolutely hopeless, and they chose to lean on the promises of God. And in the end, circumstances changed, emotions waved, and the word of God stayed the same. And so, this faith is leaning upon it. The writer of Hebrews defined faith this way. It's on the screen. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And so, essentially, just as you've been given senses in order to interact in the material world, so faith is the way we interact in the spiritual world. Right? So if you want to participate in what's going on in the material world, we have to use our senses. So, you might imagine, you're in the house, you're comfortable, you don't really want to move, and somebody says, "Oh my gosh, you got to come outside, the sunset's amazing." You're like, "I don't really want to, So you stay sitting in your lazy boy, appropriately titled, and then the next day, everybody's talking about the sunset. Everybody's talking about how amazing. Man, it was incredible, the colors, man, it was so amazing. And you're going, "I didn't see it. You didn't use your senses to participate in that." You understand? So just as our natural senses are given to us by God to interact in the material world, faith is the means by which we interact in the spiritual realm. It's how we make exchange with God. It's how we have relationship with Him. Now, Jesus put a great emphasis upon the importance of faith in the life of His followers. In fact, Jesus never seems surprised by the sinful behavior of people. Right? I mean, it's like, he comes up to Matthew. Matthew's sitting at his tax office. Matthew's got this big party planned at his house that night. He's got all the, all of the, whatever that part, whatever. Like, I'm not going to go down the road. This is tax collectors and sinners are lumped together. These guys are all going to party at Matthew's house. And Jesus goes right up to him. Just says, "Hey, why don't you follow me?" Matthew gets up, starts following Jesus. He wasn't shocked by Matthew. When that night, Matthew invites Jesus to his house. Jesus goes into that house. Like, what's going on in that house? And Jesus just goes in. He's not shocked. That he knows sinners sin. Jesus wasn't impressed by people's expressions of self-righteousness. Some guy's got his robe wrapped tightly against himself so he won't accidentally rub up against a Gentile. And he's tithed his spices, and he's made sure that he's prayed for everyone to see him at the prayer times through the day. Jesus wasn't impressed by that. He wasn't like, "Whoa, man, you guys are so righteous. Hey, disciples, act like that guy." right? He wasn't impressed. But Jesus does seem to be both impressed and surprised as it relates to faith. He was impressed when people exercised faith, and he was shocked when his followers didn't. Let me read a couple of verses to you. Matthew 8, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed him, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith even in all of Israel. He says, whoa, that's awesome. Like you're believing me. In Matthew 15, Jesus said this, oh woman, great is your faith. Let it be as you desire. And her daughter was healed. In Matthew 8, Jesus said this to the disciples, why are you fearful, O you of little faith? And then he stood up and rebuked the wind and the waves. In Matthew 14, he reached out, he grabs Peter by the hand, and he says to him, O you of little faith, why do you doubt? In Luke 8, he asked him, where's your faith? Where is it? See, there's a joy in Jesus when he sees faith exercised in the lives of people, and he seems almost surprised, shocked, like, wait, like I've been hanging out with you. I've been with you. I've been instructing you. I've been carrying you along the way, and yet you're choosing not to trust me? He seems somewhat surprised by it. Now, I think that it's important for us to understand that faith is necessary. It's the reason it's part of this currency of exchange in the kingdom is because it's necessary when we are facing the difficult seasons in life. It's important. We need to have it. I mentioned a moment ago when Jesus is on the boat with his disciples and he goes to sleep and they face a storm on the Galilee, and the storm is so severe that they don't think they're going to make it through. They think this is it for them. They're facing a difficult season in life. And in Luke 8, we'll put the verse up on the screen. This is when Jesus says to them, where is your faith? They were afraid and they marveled and they said to one another, who is this guy that the winds and the water, they obey him. They do what he says. But they're facing, and when we face difficult seasons in life, don't we? And it's important that in those difficult seasons, we choose to trust in the promise of God over the circumstance and the stirred up emotion. Faith's also necessary when we are undergoing spiritual warfare. Sometimes things just get super tense and, sorry about that, we just like all this pressure on us, and we don't really know where it's coming from. Things are just the normal things of life that we go through every single day suddenly become very difficult. It just seems to be this chaos. Well, it's because we live in two realms. We live in the natural realm. You can see it, you can hear it, you can touch it, some of it you can taste. But we also live in a spiritual realm. And there's stuff going on in the spiritual realm, and sometimes the spiritual realm has a tremendous impact upon what's going on in the material world. And we get under attack. Faith is necessary. There was a time when Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, encountered a boy who was demon possessed. I would say that's an encounter where the spiritual world is impacting the material world. And these guys are forced to have to deal with this. This dad comes and he says, you got to help my son. Like he's out of control. There's nothing we can do for him. Help. Spiritual warfare. And they tried to help, and they couldn't. So they're in the midst of spiritual warfare, and they're losing the battle. And then Jesus shows up. And you know what? I agree 100% with what you're thinking, that if Jesus showed up in the midst of all my spiritual battle, I'd take whatever rebuke he gives me. Just deal with the demoniac, right? So he cast the demon out of this boy, and then the disciples, they say to him, Lord, why couldn't we do this? These are their words exactly. They came to him privately and they said, why could we not cast it out? Listen to what Jesus said. He said, because of your unbelief. He didn't pull any punches. It's not like, gosh, Jesus, that wasn't very nice. He just told them the problem is faith and a lack of it. It's necessary. We have to exercise faith. We have to lean on the promise of God in the midst of circumstances with rising emotions. A couple more things, we'll move to the last. When we step out in faith, when we step out to serve the Lord, faith's necessary. Remember when Peter's going to step out and do something that no one else has ever done. Jesus is walking on water and Peter says, call me out there. I want to go out there. I want to go out and do something that no one else has ever done. Or we could say, I want to go out and do something I've never done. I'm going to step out of what's my comfort zone and I'm going to step out with you, Jesus. I want to do this thing. That's a lot of what ministry is. Stepping out of your comfort zone. Some of you guys, you had your homework card and some of you guys looked at it and you did the easy ones first, right? I mean, that's how you do homework, right? I mean, you've been doing it your whole life, right? Do the easy ones first, get those out of the way. And then some of them you looked at and it was like, man, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can really look for a way to share the gospel with my coworker. I know I can pray for him. I can pray that God reaches them. I'll keep praying for him, but I don't know. And then some of you went, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to step out on that water, and I'm going to see what happens. Well, you know what happened to Peter, right? Let's look at the screen. Matthew 14 says this. It says that Peter sunk, and Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and then he said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" Look at that question. Why do you doubt? I can answer that question. Well, I doubt, Jesus, because people don't stand on water. Like this is a violation of science. So that's why I'm doubting. Like I'm doubting, Lord, because it's dark out here and the rain's pelting me and I'm seeing waves about to crash on me. I'm doubting, Lord, because I realized once I stepped out of here, nobody stepped out with me. Like, Tom, like, bro, I'm out here by myself. There's all sorts of reasons why you doubt. But Jesus is, he says, you should be trusting me. You're stepping out. You have to rely upon the promises of God. One last thing as it relates to this, and we'll go to our final subject, and that is we need faith when our hearts are troubled by the circumstances of life. Doesn't that happen? Jesus said this. He said, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe in me. Hey, you got a troubled heart? What's the solution? Jesus said, faith. The solution is, remember, an active trust in the promises of God in the face of conflicting circumstances and the emotions that are produced by them. That's what you need. You got a troubled heart? You just need to go to the promises of God and say, listen, circumstances tell me no way, but you said this, Lord. Now, I want to encourage you that if you have a troubled heart, something's going on, you worry, fear, doubt, confusion, sorrow, something's troubling your heart, I want to encourage you that, that there are promises of God that were designed, they were written by God specifically for the trouble your heart's facing. Number two, I want to encourage you, or B, I guess, as I said A, I want to encourage you, come forward after the service to the prayer team leaders. Just say, listen, my heart's troubled. Do you have a prescription for my troubled heart? Like, this is what's going on in my life. Do you know any verses that can help me? Anything that I can stand on in the midst of this, that I can say, this is going to be my foundation, regardless of what's going on. And let them pray for you and let them minister to you. Last thing. Jesus has an expectation that we bear fruit. Jesus has an expectation that we walk by faith. Jesus also has an expectation that we participate in evangelism. Jesus spent a lot of time talking about reaching the world, training the disciples to reach the world. He even sent them on short-term trips before he died in preparation for them going out and changing the world. And I think it's important that we understand Jesus sees us as ambassadors to the world, and we should see ourselves that way. A couple of quick verses. John 17, verse 18 reads this way. As Jesus speaking, as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. right? Jesus says, I came into the world to seek and save that which is lost. And he says, I'm sending you into the world to seek and save that which is lost. Jesus said, I didn't come in the world to be served or to serve. I came to be served and to give my life as a ransom for many. And we should come into the world. We should go out into the world to seek to serve people in a way that we're pointing them to the one who can ransom their soul. We are to be ambassadors from Christ. I'm going to walk through some verses very quickly and give you some lessons that we can learn from Jesus' teaching on evangelism. First one, John 4:35. Jesus says this, do not say. That's called a command, right? Do not say, there are still 4 months, then comes the harvest. Behold, I say to you, lift your eyes up and look at the fields, for they are already ripe for harvest. They're ready. They're white for harvest. Now, here's what I want you to remember. The world is ready for the gospel. The world is ready for the gospel. We need to see the fields of the world, our sphere of influence, our neighborhood, our workplace, our social endeavors. We need to see those as people who are ripe and ready for the gospel. It's time that we stop seeing people as too hard, too religious, too secular, too old, too young, too different, too sinful, and we start seeing them as people who are ready for the gospel. Number 2, in John 4:36, Jesus says, he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Second thing I want you to notice is not only are the fields ripe, but we all have a part to play. Sometimes it's sowing, sometimes it's watering, sometimes it's reaping. You know, I have the blessed position of often being in a place to reap what you have sown and what you've watered. You know, so you're praying for somebody, you're living out your Christian life around them, you're sharing the gospel with them, you're doing all these things true, you're promising them that you'll take them to lunch after church if they'll go with you, you're doing all these things, you know, coercion to try to convince them to come, and then they come to church, they hear the gospel, they raise their hand, they give their life to Christ. You did all the work. I just got to reap the benefit of your sowing and your watering. We need to see we're all participating together in this Jesus' desire to reach the world. Number 3, Luke 10 says this, after these things, he appointed 70 others, sent them out 2 by 2 into the face of the city, the place where he himself was about to go, and then he said this, then he said, the harvest is truly great, the laborers are few, therefore pray for the Lord of harvest to send laborers into the harvest. First thing, we need to see the world's ready. Second thing, we need to see that we participate in it. Number 3, we need to see part of our participation is prayer. And prayer does 2 things. 1, it softens the heart of the individual you're praying for, and 2, it opens you up to how God might want to speak to you, how God might want to use you. Number 4, Luke 12 says this, now when they bring you to the synagogues and the magistrates and the authorities, don't worry about what you should answer or what you should say. Now, he didn't say don't study. He didn't say don't spend time in the Word. He didn't say don't spend time with Jesus praying about, how he can be used. But he said when you're standing in front of somebody, this tribunal, and they're threatening your life, don't worry about what to say. Here's why. Next verse says this, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that hour what you should say. That's a beautiful thing about God. Now, the interesting thing about it is rarely do I recognize, wow, that's the Lord right there, right? And if I do, I usually mess it up. But most of the time, it's after the fact you find out that was really the Lord. Someone comes later and they say, you know what you said, when you said this, and you're going, I said that? I don't remember saying that. People come up to me after the Bible study and say, hey, what was that one thing you said about, I said that? I think maybe God was speaking to you and you heard other voices in your head, and we'll talk later about that. So last thing, so listen, we need to participate in evangelism. We need to see that our lives have been chosen by Jesus Christ to go into the world and influence the world. And we need to see that. The world's ready for the gospel. We need to see that we all participate in sowing and in watering and in reaping. We need to see that we should be praying. We need to see that God will give us what we need. And then lastly, Luke 8:39 reads this way. This is Legion. He's one of my heroes. Return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you. And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city the great things God had done for him. Finally, there's great value in telling your story. There's great value in telling your story. Keep your story current. Keep growing in the Lord. Keep bearing fruit in your life. Keep your story fresh and current with Jesus, that there's always something to tell someone else about how God can impact and transform their lives. I think that it's important that we see ourselves as part of what God's desiring to do in the world. He wants to reach people for the kingdom of heaven, and we should see our life that way. And so we should see, man, I'm supposed to bear fruit in my life. And when I bear fruit in my life, I am making the gospel of Jesus Christ more attractive to other people. And then I can participate in that work. Now, the last thing I was going to talk about tonight, I think Eric might talk about some of it next week, is this. Jesus expects his children not to be limited by their own limitations. Okay? That's why he took a bunch of hillbillies and sent them into the whole world with the gospel message, and it worked.